She was called the world's first supermodel, bold, beautiful, and unforgettable. Gia Carangi wasn't just another face in a magazine. She was the magazine. In the late 1970s and early 80s, she took the fashion world by storm, walking into rooms full of legends and stealing the spotlight without even trying. With her smoky eyes, raw attitude, and natural edge, Gia didn't fit the mold, and that's exactly why everyone wanted her. Designers, photographers, and editors all chased after her. She had what others only dreamed of: fame, beauty, and a career that seemed unstoppable. But behind the flashing cameras and glossy covers was a young woman struggling to find herself. Gia's rise to the top was fast, but so was her fall. While the world saw her as a fashion icon, Gia was quietly battling loneliness, addiction, and the weight of fame that came too early and hit too hard. She had everything on the outside, but inside, she was searching for something real, something lasting. Friends watched her change. The industry turned cold. And those closest to her didn't always know how to help or when to step in. This is not just the story of a supermodel. This is the story of a young woman who wanted to be loved, who tried to escape her pain in a world that never really understood her. As her fame grew, so did the shadows around her. And by the time the world realized what was happening behind the scenes, it was already too late. So, what really happened to Gia Carangi? How did someone who seemed to have it all end up so lost? Her story is beautiful, heartbreaking, and unforgettable, and in many ways, it's a warning we still haven't learned from. Gia Carangi was born in Philadelphia in 1960, the youngest of 3 children. Her childhood wasn't easy. Her parents' relationship was full of tension, and when her mother left the family, Gia was just a teenager trying to make sense of a world that already felt unstable. That sense of abandonment stayed with her. She longed for attention, for connection, for someone to just stay. And maybe that's what made her so magnetic later on. People say the camera loved her, but really, it was Gia who gave the camera something real, something raw. She didn't pose like others. She felt everything, and it showed. At just 17, she moved to New York City and quickly became the it girl in fashion. Elite model management took her in, and she began working with top photographers like Francesco Scavallo and Chris von Wangenheim. She wasn't just featured in Vogue and Cosmopolitan, she owned the pages. While other models smiled and played the part, Gia brought a kind of edge that no one had seen before. But that edge came from a deeper place, one filled with pain she hadn't healed from. The world around her moved fast. One minute she was on top of the world, being styled by the best, walking into studios where legends worked, and the next, she was slipping through the cracks. The parties, the nightclubs, the pressure of staying thin, staying wanted, staying famous, it all became too much. The modeling world wasn't built to nurture girls like Gia. It used them up. And Gia? She started to disappear even while her face was still everywhere. She turned to drugs, slowly at first. A little something to take the edge off. But it didn't stop there. As the covers kept coming, so did the chaos. Her once bright lights started to dim. Friends noticed, but most didn't know what to do. Others looked the other way. Some were just too busy chasing their own careers. Gia was spiraling, but still showing up to shoots, still being called beautiful even when she was breaking inside. And just when it seemed like things might turn around, that maybe she'd get help, that maybe she'd find her way back, the darkness pulled her in even deeper. Gia's world was changing fast, but not in the way she hoped. She was still landing magazine covers and major campaigns, but something had shifted. The sparkle in her eyes, the fire that once made her unstoppable, it was fading. Her time in front of the camera became harder to manage. She would show up late, or sometimes not at all. And when she did, there were moments she looked distant, distracted. The industry that once praised her now began to whisper. Some said she was difficult. Others said she was losing it. But no one really asked why. The pressure to stay relevant in fashion was brutal, especially for someone like Gia who didn't play by the rules. She wasn't interested in faking smiles or being someone she wasn't. But that honesty made her vulnerable. And behind closed doors, her drug use was getting worse. Heroin became a place to hide, a way to feel less alone. The addiction didn't come from glamour, it came from pain. From years of feeling abandoned, from a business that celebrated her beauty but ignored her suffering. Her friends started to notice the changes. Some tried to help, but Gia didn't always want to be saved. Others backed away, unsure of how to handle what they were seeing. There were moments she tried to fight back. She entered rehab more than once. She tried to leave modeling behind and start fresh. For a little while, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, she could escape the spiral. She even worked at a clothing store after leaving New York, hoping for a more normal life. But the past kept pulling her back. At the same time, the fashion world was moving on. New faces were coming in, and Gia was no longer the obsession she once was. That silence, after all the noise, was deafening. For someone who had lived in the spotlight, being forgotten hurt in a different way. And still, beneath it all, Gia was just a young woman looking for love, looking to feel seen. The camera captured her beauty, but never the battles happening inside. And as her struggles deepened, so did the distance between who she was and who the world thought she should be. Every comeback attempt was met with more hurdles. And somewhere in that tug-of-war between fame and freedom, Gia was slipping further away. Gia's days began to blur into one another. There were moments of hope, yes, short bursts of energy where she tried to get clean, tried to find peace, tried to go back to the girl she used to be. But each time, something would drag her back down. A bad memory. A toxic friend. The hollow emptiness that came when the phone stopped ringing. The fashion world had moved on, and now, Gia was left chasing shadows of her past life, wondering if she'd ever belong anywhere again. She returned to New York a few times, hoping someone would still believe in her. And occasionally, someone did. A photographer might agree to shoot her again. A friend might let her crash on their couch. But these second chances never lasted long. Gia was different now, haunted, fragile. The vibrant, fearless girl who once commanded every lens had become someone the industry barely recognized. It wasn't just her looks, it was the sadness in her eyes, the way she carried herself. Like she was always on the edge of disappearing. Behind the scenes, she was in and out of clinics. There were whispers, rumors that her health was failing, that she was battling something far more serious than anyone knew. But nothing was confirmed. Gia never spoke openly about it. She kept things to herself, still holding on to that toughness that made her so unforgettable in the first place. But even the strongest people break when they feel completely alone. Her family tried to reach her. So did a few close friends. But Gia had learned to keep walls up. She had been let down too many times, and now, trusting anyone felt like a risk she couldn't afford. Still, in some moments, she wanted to believe she could start again. That there was still time to be happy, to be loved. The tension around her grew heavier. People who hadn't seen her in months started to ask questions. Why had she vanished? Was she okay? Would she come back? Some in the industry hoped for a dramatic comeback. Others quietly assumed her story was already over. But no one really knew the truth. Not yet. And as Gia moved further into the shadows, one final chapter was about to unfold, one that no one could have predicted, and one that would leave the world stunned. Just when it seemed like Gia had faded from the spotlight for good, a sudden and unexpected event pulled her back into public view. In 1985, at just 25 years old, Gia was quietly admitted to a hospital in Philadelphia. At first, it didn't make the news. No cameras. No headlines. But those closest to her noticed the shift. This wasn't another detox or short rehab stay. Something was seriously wrong this time. She was frail, thinner than ever, and her energy was gone. The spark she used to carry, even in her darkest days, was barely there. Doctors began running tests, and soon, an unthinkable diagnosis came back. Gia Carangi had contracted AIDS. At a time when the disease was still largely misunderstood, when fear and misinformation were everywhere, this diagnosis was more than just devastating, it was isolating. AIDS in the mid-1980s was seen as a death sentence. And worse, it came with enormous stigma. People didn't talk about it openly. There was judgment, fear, and silence. Gia, already battling loneliness, now found herself more isolated than ever. Some of her friends stopped visiting. Others didn't know what to say. Even some in her own family didn't understand the gravity of what she was going through. But here's where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. Despite once being one of the most photographed women in the world, Gia's final days were spent almost completely out of the public eye. She wasn't featured in glossy spreads anymore. She wasn't being styled or shot or celebrated. She was lying in a hospital bed, often alone, her past life as a supermodel feeling like a dream that had ended too soon. And for the first time, the world's silence around her was deafening. The fashion industry, once obsessed with her, did not rush to her side. No grand tributes. No statements. No magazine covers to say goodbye. It was as if Gia had never existed. As if the same world that helped build her had now turned its back, ashamed of what had happened to her. But Gia's story wasn't just a tragedy about fame or addiction, it was also about how quickly the world forgets the people it once adored. Her mother stayed by her side during those final months, watching her daughter fade away in a quiet hospital room far from the runways and cameras. Gia was one of the first women in the fashion industry to die of AIDS, but almost no one talked about it at the time. It was easier for people to pretend she had disappeared, to let her name fade away with the rest of the headlines. But behind the silence was a girl who once lit up the world, and now no one knew how to hold space for her pain. Even in her final days, Gia never stopped hoping that someone might see past the headlines and remember the real her. The girl who laughed too loud, who loved deeply, who wanted to be more than just a pretty face. But time was running out, and the world still wasn't ready to face the truth. And then, just as quietly as she had arrived in New York all those years ago, Gia slipped away, leaving behind a story that the world wouldn't fully understand until it was too late. But the silence around her death would not last forever. Something was coming, a spark that would bring her story back into the light and shake the fashion world all over again. Gia passed away on November 18, 1986, at just 26 years old. The world barely noticed. There were no magazine covers, no tributes from the fashion houses she once brought to life. Her name wasn't even mentioned in the fashion press. She died quietly, like a secret the industry didn't want to talk about. But her story wasn't over, not yet. A few years later, something unexpected happened. A documentary crew working on a piece about the early days of the AIDS crisis stumbled across her name in a hospital archive. They didn't recognize it at first. But one researcher, flipping through old fashion magazines, suddenly gasped. Gia Carangi. She wasn't just anyone. She had once been everywhere. The more they looked, the more stunned they became. How had someone so famous vanished so completely? That discovery triggered a ripple effect. Journalists started digging. Fashion insiders who had stayed silent began to speak. Former friends and photographers stepped forward, sharing personal stories, lost photos, and memories that painted a fuller picture of Gia, not just as a model, but as a human being who had lived and loved deeply. The world slowly began to realize just how much it had ignored. Then, in 1998, the biggest twist of all, HBO released a biopic titled Gia, starring Angelina Jolie. The film brought Gia's story to an entirely new generation. Suddenly, people wanted to know more. Who was this woman who had everything and still lost it all? The film didn't shy away from her pain, but it also showed her strength, her vulnerability, and her fight to be seen for more than just her beauty. And just like that, Gia Carangi was no longer forgotten. But even with this return to the spotlight, one final truth remained. Gia's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror, a reflection of how fame can lift someone up and leave them behind. A reminder of how easily the world turns away when things get uncomfortable. Her death didn't just mark the end of a career, it marked a shift in how we talk about mental health, addiction, and love in an industry built on appearances. In the end, the girl who couldn't be saved ended up saving something much bigger, a conversation the world had been avoiding for far too long. Gia's legacy, once buried under years of silence and shame, slowly found its way back into the light. The release of the HBO film brought her story to millions, but more importantly, it reminded people that behind every perfect photo, behind every model's flawless face, is a real human being with pain, with history, with a heart that longs to be understood. Fans who never knew her when she was alive began searching her old interviews, her magazine spreads, her rare candid moments, trying to piece together the real Gia Carangi. And what they found was more than just a beautiful woman. They found someone who challenged the fashion industry just by being herself. She didn't try to be polished. She didn't pretend to be untouchable. Gia was raw, emotional, sometimes difficult, sometimes fragile, but always real. In an industry that praised perfection, she offered something else: authenticity. And maybe that's why she still matters today. Because in a world that still struggles with mental health, with addiction, with accepting those who live outside the box, Gia's life feels heartbreakingly familiar. Her story opened doors. After her death, conversations around AIDS became more urgent, more compassionate. Slowly, the fashion world began to look at how it treated its stars, the pressure, the isolation, the silence around mental health. Gia wasn't the only one who struggled, but she became one of the first whose pain couldn't be ignored anymore. Today, Gia Carangi is remembered not just as a supermodel, but as a symbol of a deeper truth. That fame can't heal wounds. That beauty doesn't protect you from pain. And that sometimes, the brightest lights burn out the fastest. But even in her short life, Gia left something lasting, something that can't be erased. She had it all, but no one could save her. And yet, through her story, she's helped save others. She showed the world what happens when we only see the surface and forget to look deeper. And maybe, just maybe, by remembering Gia, we're reminded to love a little more, to listen a little closer, and to never forget the human being behind the image.